Friends, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being back with us. We hope that you had a great Easter weekend. And kind of as we alluded to last week, the timing of this, and we can't take credit for it because it certainly wasn't planned, but the timing works out well. We're fortunate in that today we move into chapter 20 of the Gospel of John, which is John's Easter story. And as is the case, generally, John has a different spin, some details that are not in the other Gospels. So today we'll look at not even the front half. We'll look at the front part of the story, and then I'll start reading here. We'll come back and talk it through. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciples set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrapping lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up and placed by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as of yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. So I mentioned only John gives us this kind of footrace story. The idea that first Mary Magdalene, who goes in this instance by the tomb to herself, or at least no one else is mentioned, she comes back. She tells them that she can't find Jesus' body. For some reason, only John and Peter, who are kind of the two primary disciples in most of the gospel stories, take off running. Well, I should back up, Michael. We scholars, I'm sorry, I didn't fill that in. The reference here is to the disciple that Jesus loved. That is generally understood to be John. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong here, Michael, but I think the vast bulk of scholarship and scholarly biblical work says that this is very likely to be John himself. And so they run to the tomb. John's faster than Peter, maybe also younger. Interestingly enough, John hesitates, but if you know the gospel portrayal of Peter, he never hesitates. He runs right in. They both see the clothes, but John sees and believes, and then they do not yet understand, and they return to their homes. Which probably doesn't mean their own houses. It means to the place they had been. Lots of interesting things happening here, Michael. We have it's pretty, as we've said, probably for the last couple weeks as we've been working our way to the resurrection story, kind of scant details, a pretty condensed telling. John could spin this out longer, but doesn't. Kind of a lot going on here, and interesting the things that John gives us and the way he gives us the details that are not found in the other stories.
We see a lot of the characters making an appearance really quickly. There's a strong economy in this story because you see Mary is that one who goes to the tomb, comes back. Then you have this idea that you've got these two other disciples, and you have this idea that there's a kind of not competition as much as there's a display of leadership priority that's happening in who's getting to the tomb first. There's the foot race has some interesting implications for how these leaders of the church both will move forward as being core witnesses to what they've seen and what they come to believe. This idea of outrunning Peter is certainly fascinating when this is couched within the telling that John is giving. And to your point, Clint, the idea that scholarship, they talk about this being a way of the author remaining humble, right? The idea that without naming yourself as being central to the story, you can also say, I was there. Hey, by the way, when I talk about being a witness, that's not just me saying that I'm collecting other stories, but I've been part of it. There's a relational aspect to that kind of witness. And so this foot race, I think, is fascinating because on one hand, it's a jab because Peter doesn't get there first. On the other hand, it's the admission, John is a person with caution and a person looking to see the whole situation. And Peter runs right in and is the first to enter into the tomb to see what's there. So there's an honoring of the fact that Peter's the rock upon which the church. There's a lot of those details happening in a story like this, Clint.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, on one hand, it probably is humble not to put your name in, but when you give yourself the title, the disciple whom Jesus loved, maybe it pushes back on that humility just a touch. One of the things that I think scholarship is helpful in assisting us to see is that this gospel is very likely written within and to a community that was very supportive of John, that was very influenced by John. And so, again, this idea that the disciple Jesus loved would be very comforting, very inspiring to a group of people who at least looked themselves to the line of John's testimony and thought of themselves as kind of an extension of John's own faith, that they thought of themselves as John's people. He's their beloved pastor, their beloved disciple. He's kind of their origin story as they might understand it. And so we see here, I think, whether he gives himself this name or whether someone else helps him get there, I think it's easy to see why that would have been celebrated. There's another detail, I think, Michael, that is here that I've always been fascinated with. It says that the wrappings were lying there, and then in verse 7, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head was not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And that word rolled up implies almost folded. In other words, it wasn't thrown. There was a certain order to it, like it had been placed there on purpose. And I heard a wonderful take on this that was essentially along the lines of, if we're ever tempted to think that Jesus somehow, ran breathlessly out of the tomb or narrowly escaped death, this is John's little nod to the victory being so complete that Jesus got up and folded his clothes before he left the tomb, that his resurrection was so total and so final that he's not running from anyone. He took time to put the cloth away in an orderly fashion. And I don't know if that's the intention here, Michael. I'm not sure that's what John is or isn't trying to tell us, but I think it's a nice way to look at that detail.
Yeah, I think that absolutely helps us. And I think we should know this, Clint, also, that we now have the return of clothing as a meaning, in which we had that explicitly pointed out just a few verses ago when the centurions, the Romans, were dividing, casting lots over Jesus's clothes. And so here, at the end of the day, the last clothes that Jesus was supposed to wear are now left behind. There is, in a book like John, going to be theological significance to that. I also want to point out that the other Gospels include their own ways of pushing back on the idea of a body theft, which was a natural belief that would be had, that someone just went in and took the body. And of course the disciples didn't find Jesus's body because someone else took him in, went in there, broke in, took the body. And part of the lesson in this, I think, very practically is no grave robber goes in and takes the body and leaves behind folded grave clothes. That would not make any sense at all. So this is also a nod for those who might be skeptics to say, no, listen, some of those assumptions you're making about what happened is not true. And the reason they need to do that, by the way, and we're in the Easter season liturgically here, that's just the moment that we're recording this. Listen, people have been doubting the resurrection since literally day one. And let's not miss that even within this text, right? The other disciple who reached the tomb first and went in, he saw and believed, but they did not fully understand yet the scripture. So whereas the other gospels are going to have even embedded in it a portion of doubt, here John's not going to ascribe that to John's experience, but yet there's still a lack of awareness, a fullness of understanding what's happening. They have to go back and they have to see all of these things come together in the revealed presence of Christ. And I think that's an important reminder in this story, is that it's not here to answer all of our questions about how things happen. It is, however, addressing some of the deeper concerns that people were raising about these disciples' witness. And John is embedding both the theological meaning with the practical sort of the notes that need made to help people along that path.
I think there's a nice devotional element to that as well. We often think that understanding precedes believing, that you have to understand something before you could put your faith in it. And here, for this disciple, exactly the opposite is true. He believes, he just doesn't yet understand the scripture. His faith precedes his knowledge, his understanding. And I think that there's a really powerful invitation in that. We will struggle if we need to understand Easter before we can believe it. We will struggle if we need to understand resurrection, and if we think we need to make sense of the empty tomb before we can believe it, before we can embrace it in faith. We will have a hard time, I think. And I think there's a flow to this that is helpful, because I think it feels true in our own lives that we put our faith in something, and once we do, then we move toward understanding what it means. But it doesn't always necessarily work the opposite way. Faith often comes first, and then we move toward understanding. And I think a lot of people in our day and age maybe assume that that's the other way around.
So it's interesting. I think the story embeds that lesson in a really consistent way, and we see it again here today. And if you've been with us for the study, this is not going to be new to you, but I just want to have us all look back on verse 1 here. It's the first day of the week when it is still dark. And if you've been with us through the study of John, we've mentioned how important the time of day is, and even the amount of light present in the scene. And here, the disciples, when they arrive at the tomb, they arrive in darkness. And this idea that they get into the tomb, I just think this is powerful. They get into the tomb and they begin to understand, they begin to see. There is belief here, right? But the understanding is not yet complete. How are they going to get that? Explicitly, the scriptures, right? This is a teaching moment. It's to say, if you get to the tomb in the darkness, where are you going to turn to understand on the other side of belief? You're going to turn to the scriptures. You're going to turn to the accounts of what God has done. And of course, the scriptures referenced here would be what we would call the Old Testament, a firm understanding of how God's been working throughout the whole of history. This is a cosmic story that John is telling. And I just think even those small details about the time of day that this is, it gives us a sense for where the disciples are at in their individual journeys right now. And it's not full day yet. They don't have complete comprehension, that they're not the master preachers of the thing they witnessed yet. That's still coming. Right now, they're people encountering a thing that is unbelievable, that they are leaning into, and it's leading them down a path of discipleship.
I think it's really interesting, Michael, that in some of the other Gospels, they sort of try to put us in the story, us being the reader. Is he, isn't he, did he, didn't he? I think, Mark, maybe Matthew to an extent, lesser extent, but trying to draw us in as characters or have us enter the story. John, I think, always allows the reader to know more than the characters. And so we watch the characters here with the full knowledge that Jesus has risen. And in the narrative, we already know that, right? He tells us that they didn't understand Jesus must rise from the dead. You, the reader, understand that. And that gives John a unique flavor, because then we get to watch the characters and how they react to this news as it dawns on them or as they encounter it. And I think that is a different affect than reading some of the other gospel portrayals. I appreciate about John that he always allows us to know what's happening as it happens or before it happens. And so then we become an observer of the characters in the story in a way that I think is more true than it is in some of the other tellings.
Because in a way, since we are a third party looking in, John does cast these characters in fully human clothes. I mean, we see these characters with their doubts, with all of their misgivings. There's a real sense in which John doesn't shy away from the fact that these men, and as we're going to see tomorrow, these women are all in radically different places trying to understand what's happening to and around them. And there's a way in which John is giving permission to us, the reader, in that equation, because we know this of ourselves. We know that we as humans are a mixed bag, full of moments of great faith and believing, and also many doubts and sinfulness and brokenness. And all of this besets us in this complicated churn that we call life, right? And John is comfortable showing us Jesus Christ, who has perfect intention and perfect execution on that intention his entire life. And the men and women who surround him are in many ways jostling back and forth because of their reality, and yet they are the witnesses that give us the hope and promise of what they see in this man, Jesus Christ. It's the fact we can relate to these disciples, the fact that they get to the tomb, and we can imagine all the feelings that they feel that lead them from despair to hope, and then we think, well, what's going to happen next to them as they go along the journey? That's exactly what a disciple is, and that's what John's trying to show us through their reactions.
And even this 20th chapter, John, it just is the case. John unfolds this story for us in more acts than do the other Gospels. So this is just scene one, and there are multiple scenes to come. John paints more portraits of this day than do Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John includes more of a variety of stories, some different details. So thank you for joining us on scene one. Hope you can be with us as we continue through. John does some really fascinating things with Easter, and I hope you'll be able to be a part of it as we continue.
We'll be back tomorrow. See you then.